people to gather. Why don't we give folks a little bit of your background? I think they will quickly notice that you have a background that's different than perhaps many of the people we've been talking to.
Sure. First of all, thanks, Lee, and also Carrie for the invitation to speak. It's always a delight for an academic scholar to address broader public audiences about history, and that's the raison d'etre of your group, Pursuit of History, and it's terrific to be here. So I'm London born and did my first degree at Kingston Polytechnic at a time when I was serious about higher education. Margaret Thatcher, who was Premier in the UK, was not. So I, along with a bunch of other Brits, crossed the Atlantic. I actually got a Fulbright to do a PhD at UPenn in US history. And it was during that process that I realized that, you know, a love of mine, which was history, could actually earn me a good living and an interesting living and an exciting living, which was sort of possible in the US and much more difficult in the UK. So I ended up staying. And so 30 years later, now I'm teaching history at in the history department at Howard University. Excellent,
excellent. Well, we're delighted you stayed. We're delighted you're spending your Thursday evening with us. Let me welcome everyone. I'm Lee Wright. I'm the founder of History Camp. I'm near Boston. And with us behind the scenes tonight is Carrie Lund. She's the executive director of the Pursuit of History, which is the organization that brings these to you every week. Carrie worked hard to arrange this and is, like I said, joining us behind the scenes. With us tonight is Jeffrey Kerr Ritchie, born in London. Jeffrey majored in history at Kingston University, earned a history doctorate at the University of Pennsylvania after winning a Fulbright Hays Scholarship. He worked at Howard University since 2006, where he teaches slavery, emancipation, and the African diaspora. He served as the Director of Graduate Studies since 2015 and authored several books, including the one that we're going to talk about tonight. His most recent book, Rebellious Passage, The Creole Revolt, America's Coastal Slave Trade. Thank you very much for joining us.
Pleasure to be here.
I think it's many people may have heard of the one particular revolt. Perhaps it'd be useful to just kind of take this larger sense. How often did this occur across the various types of voyages, and then let's zero in then on the coastal passage.
Okay, so the Atlantic slave trade essentially spanned nearly 4 centuries, from the 1440s through to the 1860s, when Spain finally abolished its Atlantic slave trade. The United States abolished its Atlantic slave trade in 1808, as did Great Britain. The scholarly consensus is that during that nearly 4 century long period, around 1 in 10 of every slave trading ship engaged in the business in the Atlantic slave trade experienced some type of slave revolt. Most of your audience will be familiar with the Amistad Rebellion in 1839, either through history classes or through Steven Spielberg's movie. The Creole slave ship revolt is not a revolt against the Atlantic slave trade, but against the coastal passage, and I will make that distinction clearer as time goes on. But it's important to recognize that a major part of Atlantic slave trading involved slaves resisting the slave trade, even though many of the revolts and rebellions actually failed.
Well, that's very interesting. As I said, I think most people know the one. Tonight they'll learn of the second. That certainly puts it in a broader context. What are some of the differences and as well as some of the similarities between the Middle Passage and then the Coastal Passage? And you might kind of take us through what are some of the major ports on that Coastal Passage.
Okay, so I think one of the key differences is spatial. The Atlantic slave trade is really engaging the entire Atlantic and a lot of the ports up and down Scotland, England, France, Portugal, Spain, etc., as well as West Africa, Central Africa ports, Southeast Africa ports, and then on the other side in the Americas and the Caribbean, the North America and South America, and ports are therein much bigger. The space for the coastal passage essentially is the Southeast Atlantic. It's the Caribbean and Gulf seas, much smaller. Temporally, in terms of the time frame, we're really talking about the 1440s, the 1860s, as I've already mentioned. The coastal passage, much shorter, ran from 1808, established after the abolition of the Atlantic slave trade in the United States, to 1864, when a Republican-controlled legislature, obviously during the American Civil War, abolished the coastal passage. And a year later, of course, the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution abolishes the institution of American slavery. The numbers of captives involved were very different. The Atlantic slave trade, about 10.8 million people were moved or basically survived the Atlantic slave trade. In other words, made it across to the Americas. In the coastal passage, as far as we know, it's around 50,000, 50,000, not 500,000 captives. Mortality rates much higher for captives and sailors in the Atlantic slave trade than in the coastal passage. And a final important difference concerns documentation. For the Middle Passage, historians rely largely on the ship's logs and the Voyages database. Some of your audience might be interested in the Voyages database, which is an incredible collection of documents pertaining to the Atlantic slave trade out of Emory University. And you can access it online. It's free. Basically gives us this detailed, a very detailed breakdown of slave ships in the Atlantic, engaged in the Atlantic slave trade. In contrast, the coastal passage documentation largely consists of ship manifests. And assuming that our connectivity is working, perhaps Carrie could bring up a document 2, which is the Creole Manifest, dated March 1842. And what's important about these manifests is that, thank you, every slave ship engaged in the coastal passage, in the American coastal passage, was required to fill in one of these forms. These are set forms, and at the top, I don't know how clear this is for you, but at the top, you've essentially got the name of the ship, the name of the captain, and the port of embarkation, Richmond, and the port of arrival, New Orleans. And then on the left-hand side, you've got the column of captives, and they're identified by name and age, color, height, etc. And then you've got the consignee, the person who owns the captive, and the place in which that consignee lives. And then most interestingly, at the bottom, you have the signature of the port collector. So the port collector in Richmond must sign off on this manifest in order for the ship to leave. And in order for the ship to disembark the captives, to unload its captives, the cargo had to be considered to be authentic. And so the port collector in New Orleans would have to sign off. And what's important about these manifests is that they give us a very detailed sense of the coastal passage. And my book is just it's a tiny glimpse into this very rich corpus of documentation. The problem with this documentation is that it's spread in federal archives throughout the South. Ironically, very few of them are in the Library of Congress or the National Archives, but they're in various archives in the South, and they await their historian.
Very interesting. Give us help us understand the purpose of that transport. Were there any particular kind of conditions under which that was most likely to occur?
Yes, the Coastal Passage was part of a broader forced transportation of enslaved Americans from the Upper South to the Lower South between the early 1800s and really the 1860, 1861, the outbreak of the American Civil War. And the major purpose was to provide labor for plantations engaged in the production of cotton and sugar. Cotton, in many ways, was the driving force of the American economy by the mid-19th century. English and French, but especially English textile mills, especially in the north of England, were demanding the product of cotton, which they would then turn into a finished material and export. And so the problem that Southern slaveholders faced was they needed cheap and exploitable labor to grow this cotton. And the figures are astonishing. Most scholars of what's variously called the domestic slave trade or the internal slave trade, or as I like to call it, the interstate slave trade. Most scholars agree that about 1 million people were moved from 1800 to 1860. And in the Coastal Passage, about 50,000 were moved out of that 1 million. And it was largely to engage in plantation, a very lucrative plantation cash crop production.
Okay. Well, let's go through the incidents here behind the Creole. Help us with the time period, and then some of the specifics, and perhaps some insight into why this one was successful when some of the others had not been.
Okay, so you want me to talk about the
let's do that. Yeah.
The slave ship revolt itself. Well, the Creole was a ship first registered out of Richmond in the late 1830s. It was 187 tons. Its business primarily was to move captives as well as other products, tobacco, etc., and wheat to the Lower South. It left Richmond, Virginia, in late October 1841, and had an expected arrival in New Orleans in late November. That was usually about a month's. The journey was usually about a month in the Coastal Passage. On board were 139 captives, consisting of men, women, children, and 4 infants. There were also several white passengers. There was a small white crew, and a Captain Ensor. Now, I don't know if Carrie can bring up a map this is a map of the Creole routes, and I think it's document 3, a map of the Creole route, right? And what's useful about this map is that it gives us a sense of the shipping lanes that most slave ships engaged in. So you can see this ship is leaving the upper south of Richmond, and then it's heading south. It's hugging the coast, but that's a few hundred miles. Obviously, you can't. It's very difficult to steer close to the Outer Banks. Obviously, it's deadly for ships. And these ships would head south, and then they would touch the Bahamas. They had to keep clear of Florida, what were called the Florida Straits then, and then they would move into the Gulf. And sometimes they would stop at Mobile, Alabama, Pensacola, but most of these ships ended up in New Orleans. This was the route that, and this took about 4 weeks, as I say, and this was the route, the expected route of the Creole. On the night of Sunday, November the 9th, 1841, 19 of the captives seized the ship, attempted to seize the ship. There was an altercation. After 2 hours, the crew had been defeated. The rebels seized the ship. There were 2 deaths in this slave revolt. One of a white overseer who's in charge of a number of the captives, and one rebel. But there were also serious injuries to the first mate and also the captain. In fact, the captain was so incapacitated that he was incapable of command. And the rebels ordered the ship steered to Nassau, in the capital of the Bahamas, which is, of course, a British colony at the time. One question is, why did the rebels steer the ship to Nassau in the Bahamas? And my explanation is that there had been a lot of information and rumor about previous ships that had, either through revolts or more often through poor weather, hurricanes, etc., had been driven to British colonies, and that British had refused to return the slaves to these ships and also to the United States authorities, especially after 1833, because the British had passed their British colonial or British Emancipation Act, essentially ending slavery in the British Empire. So this knowledge became unknown to the Creole rebels, and I think it's the reason why they take the ship to Nassau. It's there for a week. There are 18 of the rebels are kept aboard on a longboat, and they're guarded by a company of 100 men who are members of the British West India Regiment, which essentially were former slaves who, in exchange for freedom and pay, ended up fighting for the British, assisting the British in their managing their empire. There is a dispute between the United States consul, a guy called Bacon, who is there. There are a lot of US consuls around the world who engage in various activities. And he's in a dispute with the governor of the colony, Governor Cockburn, over whether these slaves and rebels should be returned to American hands because they're property, and also these rebels are responsible for the death of an American. Or for Cockburn, should they be released because the Bahamas is free soil. What makes the case really interesting is that during this week, the Creole ship, where all of these captives, putative captives now really, are on board, the ship is surrounded by hundreds of small Bahamian boats and they are being manned by Bahamians who are armed and have guns, and they have knives, and they have various other weapons, who are basically saying this ship is going nowhere. And, you know, it's pure speculation, of course, but to what extent was Governor Cockburn facing the reality that there wasn't much, that this could become quite an incident? Long story short, the British colonial officials decided not to interfere with the captives' decision to either leave the ship, the Creole, or stay on board and be taken on to New Orleans, where, of course, they would remain slaves. All except 5 walked off the ship onto the waiting boats. Now, this is a very, very important point of the book. This non-interference by the British colonial authorities is often seen as an act of Britain freeing the slaves. I disagree. I think that what we see here is slaves freeing themselves as the cumulative effect of a rebellion by these 9 rebels. They're abiding their time. They're walking off the boat, aided by Bahamian boatmen. The final part of the story is that the rebels were housed in the Nassau jail. And in fact, you can go there nowadays. There's a picture of it in the book. It's a beautiful green and pink building. It's a public library, but that is where they were held, in the dungeon. But they were acquitted in April 1842 for lack of evidence for the murder of this American overseer. During that time, a second rebel had died in jail as a consequence of his wounds accrued through the rebellion. And most of the captives, former captives from the Creole, either stayed in the Bahamas, some went to Jamaica, others scattered around, the Bahamian archipelago, and enjoy freedom.
I have to ask about the 5 that decided to remain on board.
Most people do. Unfortunately, all we have is a description of their not leaving. There is a major court case, if we got time, I'll go into it later on, in 1845, 4 years later, where slaveholders with slaves aboard the Creole sue the insurance companies. So we have a real copious documentation on the Creole slave ship revolt. It made it to the court case made it to the Louisiana Supreme Court. But we don't know, getting back to the question, we don't know precisely. All we can do is speculate. I think that it's a family, and I think that what their desire or their decision should not be, I'm not persuaded that it's an indication of them having any preference whatsoever for a return to slavery. I think it has more to do with the complicated nature, right, of being enslaved and family. Do we know, for example, if they had family in New Orleans? Do we know if other people might suffer as a consequence of them not? We don't know this, but I think I'm more interested in thinking about it as a sort of an indication of how difficult the decisions must have been in terms of wanting freedom, but not necessarily being able to attain it.
Well, I am intrigued by that court case. We also want to talk about kind of the larger historical significance here and so forth. But why don't we spend a minute on that court case? We're so far removed today from these sorts of events. It seems at first perhaps kind of shocking that here 4 years later, right, there's this court case and so on, but perhaps unsurprising at the time because this was commerce, right, and there was an insurer and so forth.
Yes, so it's important to recognize that trading slaves across the oceans was a very profitable business. And like most profitable businesses, required insurance against risk. And in fact, some of the earliest insurance companies in England, for example, very early on got involved in insuring English slave ships. Lloyd's of London is a classic example. In the United States, in the coastal passage, the vast majority of the ships took out insurance policies on their cargo. I should say, sorry, the people moving the cargo took out insurance policies to guarantee against the risk of loss. This was the case with the Creole. What the owners, and many of whom were slave traders, not plantation owners, some were, but a number of them were merchants, professional slave traders. They had insured their human cargo either in Richmond or in New Orleans with insurance companies. They sued in the lower courts of New Orleans, and they won their case. And the insurance companies were made liable for the loss of these slaves. But the insurance companies appealed the case, and it went to the Supreme Court, and the Chief Justice Supreme Court, Chief Justice Bullard, basically ruled in favor of these insurance companies with a very interesting rationale, which was that the insurance companies were not culpable because the loss had been a consequence of slave rebellion. And slave rebellion was not covered in these contracts. And I've always been struck by the irony that here you have the most powerful jurist in a slave state of Louisiana basically acknowledging that a slave revolt, okay, had a sort of reprieved insurance companies. So that was that, and these insurance companies were not required to pay. But that's not the end of the story. In 1853, there had been so many difficulties, financial difficulties between Americans and British interests, really since the 1812-1814 war, and I go into this in the first chapter, that it was felt imperative that a claims commission be created to sort out these various claims. And it's a fascinating document. It's in the Senate proceedings, and the actual document is listed, and you can access it actually online. But what is very interesting is that in a very quiet London residence in 1853, the slave owners and slave traders who owned human cargo in the Creole, who lost it and didn't look like they were going to get money, were paid, received their compensation for their losses. And the British government ended up paying 110,000 US dollars in 1853, which is in today's money is over $3 million. And the major reason for this was because of the very powerful economic connections between the United States and the UK. Again, a lot of people and students especially think that sort of slave-based cotton was not that significant in the US economy. It is phenomenally important. And I usually use one statistic to demonstrate this. In 1860, 59% of all US exports were in cotton. It's a driver of the economy. And so the British and the Americans had to be careful here. This is quite a lucrative relationship. So anyway, that's really the end of the law case, but certainly not the end of British-American relations.
That is very interesting. I'm glad we went that far forward. Should we talk about the larger historical significance of the revolt beyond this one particular incident and the ramifications?
Well, yes. I I think there are several ways to talk about the historical significance of the Creole Revolt. The first and most obvious is that the Creole Revolt offers an international dimension to the sectionalism, which is gripping antebellum America. The reactions to the Creole Revolt are very different, of course. In the North, amongst abolitionists and anti-slave trade activists, the Creole Revolt is seen as an example of the struggle for human rights against the tyranny of slavery. But in the South, it's seen in a very different way. The Creole Revolt is seen as incendiary, as a dangerous example, and most importantly, as an abnegation of the right of Americans to protect their property, and the failure of the federal government to return that private property. So in that sense, it can be seen as contributing to the politicization of sectionalism, which ends up in a bloody civil war. I always question the tragic label of American Civil War, since as a student of slavery and abolition, I identified this war as being the war which also ended slavery. Right? So, there's irony in the tragedy, which is what I think a lot of historians are pointing to with the deaths, etc. But it certainly ended the institution of slavery. I think other aspects of this significance, very briefly, it's a remarkable historical event, the Creole Revolt. And I think it deserves to be better known. It's why I decided to write the book, and it's also why I wanted to take the opportunity to share it in this program. I think it's also historically significant because it's an example of bottom-up history. Here you have 19 rebels who will never be known, who will never be famous, essentially acting in a way which causes London, Washington, Richmond, New Orleans, Nassau in the Bahamas, etc., to respond to their actions. That's phenomenal and very, very interesting. And finally, I think that it's historically significant because I think what the Creole Revolt sort of tells us is that human beings' pursuit of liberty springs eternal.
Excellent. On that point, let's go to questions from viewers. Let me start with this one. Was Solomon Northrop sent south using the coastal passage?
Yes.
Okay.
And in fact, he's on the. He would have been one of many, and I mentioned him. He's actually, and I've forgotten the ship that he was transported on. But yes.
Did the Amistad case have any impact on this court case?
On the court case, I went through the lower court proceedings, the Supreme Court proceedings. They're printed, so they're easy to read, 250, 300 pages. I've read them several times. I didn't see a single mention of the Amistad in the lower court proceedings, which were 1842, and as well as the Supreme Court case in 1845. And that, of course, was several years after the Amistad case. So I don't think it had an impact on the court case. Some historians have argued that the rebels on the Creole were influenced by the example of the Amistad because it had occurred earlier Remember the Amistad Revolt, 1839, the Creole Revolt, 1841. Again, the court records don't suggest that. It's sort of pure speculation. I'm more persuaded that the pens in which captives were held, like most prisons, breed discontent. And it's a place to plot. And I think the combination of this time and space to try to do something about one's condition, paired with the knowledge that the British have abolished slavery. If you can get to free soil, right, you have an opportunity, you have a chance to become free. And that's also known because of fugitive slaves who crossed the border to Canada in that period. Then I think those sorts of things are probably more important than actually the Creole, the Amistad Rebellion itself.
Let me follow up on that. To what extent did word of this, go out widely? Do you think that individuals who were enslaved in various plantations and so forth would have heard about this? Certainly, I assume those involved in the trade as merchants and so forth, and insurers and so on would have. And I guess this question really goes to the Amistad, the Creole, any of these other incidents. To what extent do you think that information got to enslaved individuals themselves?
It's a very important question, and of course, it's a question which historians have been asking for the last 2 decades. Given the technological transformation of forms of communication, let's hope that we don't lose ours here. What's important to recognize is that ships moved people, people speak, people communicate. Ships carry newspapers. It only needs one literate person in a group of 1,000, right, to share information. And these ships are moving and crossing oceans. So yeah, word of mouth gets out, and of course it's a little slower than the internet and email. But what's clear, what becomes quite evident, is the knowledge that a number of enslaved people have about events, and sometimes it's quite astonishing. I've written about the impact of the Haitian Revolution on the Americas, this revolution against slavery, and which produces the Republic of Haiti in 1804. And this knowledge isn't just, the Haitian Revolution isn't just sort of known about in large urban cities in the Caribbean, in South America, and also the United States, but it's also in these rural areas, places where you don't ordinarily would not ordinarily expect that sort of information to seep down. But then if you think about it, rivers connecting people, information travels. And so I think that certainly knowledge of the Creole Revolt would have been not unknown. It would have been shared. But also you have the situation where abolitionists are talking about it, propagandizing around it, and Southern newspapers who are opposed to slave revolts are unfortunately also inadvertently spreading the word. And of course they get the benefits, because during the American Civil War, we know that sort of, northern newspapers spreading information, military intelligence, right? Like Union troops, okay, that information is being read by Southern military generals. So, that type of sort of exchange, movement of information, I think is quite critical.
Another question. What can you tell us about Madison Washington's role in the revolt? Was he the leader? I've read that he was inspired by the story of Cinquez.
Yes. Madison Washington is often identified as the titular head of the Creole Revolt. Unfortunately, I found no evidence to suggest that he was. He was one of 4 leaders of the 19. And they're clearly identified in the court records and testimony. They're recognized as leaders in the British official papers. They're recognized as leaders in US Senate testimony in 1841, 1842. But I think what really inspired this story was that in the spring of 1842, the Liberator newspaper, the abolitionist, William Lloyd Garrison's abolitionist newspaper based in Boston, Mass, wrote a heroic story of Madison Washington. And that sort of identified him as this leader. And then about 10 years later, the famous former slave, abolitionist, and Black activist Frederick Douglass wrote his novella, The Heroic Slave, which centers Madison Washington as the leader of the Creole Revolt. But as I say, I see very little evidence of him being the only leader.
A question I meant to ask earlier, in these court proceedings, to what extent were the enslaved individuals called to testify?
They would not have been called to testify, largely because they were enjoying their freedom. And for them, freedom was not to be identified with either terra firma in the American South, let alone a courtroom in New Orleans.
Sure.
It was one of those interesting sort of court cases. The witnesses were quite sparse, but those people who did testify were members of the some of the crew members of the Creole did testify, especially the first mate. He ended up being very important because the captain was so incapacitated as a consequence of his wounds. The first mate was a really important witness, but others were on the high seas.
Got it. One more question here. Did this case have any effect on the Fugitive Slave Act and its aftermath?
It's a good question. I don't think that the Creole slave ship revolt had a major impact on the Fugitive Slave Act. The Fugitive Slave Act, of course, passed in 1850, essentially beefing up the 1793 Fugitive Slave Act, largely a demand on the part of Southern slaveholders, especially in the upper South states of Maryland, Virginia, and to some extent Kentucky, to protect their property, which had the rather annoying tendency to free itself from the clutches of slave owners. And that was largely a landed border issue, right, between the slave states and northern and western free states. Where I do think there's a tangential connection is the Fugitive Slave Act is an indication of how utterly fearful Southern slaveholders were of mass escapes by slaves, and that the Creole Revolt again suggested or might well encourage slaves to act in ways which were obviously counterproductive to the interests of Southern slaveholders.
Well, thank you. We have a link to Jeffrey's book in the chat. It covers a lot more ground than we were able to talk about tonight. If you did enjoy our discussion, I'm sure you did, please consider telling your friends about future discussions. Next week, we're going to be speaking with Jon Grinspan about the era after the Civil War. It was one of the most politically divisive and volatile times in our country. Think about sharing that upcoming event with your friends on social media or via email, and consider making a small donation to the Pursuit of History, the nonprofit organization that brings these to you every week. Thanks so much for joining us, Jeffrey. Thanks very much for spending your Thursday with us.
My pleasure, and thank you, Lee.